Okay, so let's start working on the chassis. But before I do so, I just want to point something out because I believe I just basically glossed over this really quickly. Notice the profile here. You'll notice that the drive shaft comes down at an angle. And that's because you wanted to shift, or the designers wanted to shift the center of gravity towards the front. Now, in order for that to happen, the thing is, the drive shaft can't come down to be level because the spur gear can't come down any further. So that's why it has to travel at an angle. And if it travels at an angle, the spur gear being at an angle, the motor needs to be at an angle as a result, since the spur gear is at an angle. So that's why you see the drive shaft not being perfectly parallel, because it wouldn't have been able to do that due to the spur gear, the size of the spur gear. So the spur gear had to be at an angle in order to be a 90-degree with the drive shaft, and hence the motor needed to be, the same in order to line up with the spur gear. So that's not weird. Something is not wrong. That's just the design. So, all right. So let's start building this out now. Next thing we're going to do then is place shock mounts on each side. So these basically go like this. So this piece here goes on the outside, just like that, and then these two got to stick out sideways, for the shocks to mount. So they're going to go like that. And we got 10 millimeter screws that we're going to use for this. Okay. So there are little tabs. There are little tabs right here, and those go on the edges of the chassis. That kind of hold them in place. Oops. The little metal bar goes underneath the chassis. Now I remember. And then this will slide on top of the little plates there. And that'll hold this in place. We have 12 millimeter screws that hold these down. And they're held underneath by this guy. Okay. So. Okay, so now that we have that in place, let's start looking at these guys here. So I know for sure we're going to need a rod end. On both of these, no question about that. Okay, these two guys here that I'm going to need bearings for on each side. Okay. Then I'm going to need a drive shaft for these guys. I think the drive shaft, though, that I need for these, I want to make sure I get the right ones. So I'm looking at this, and I want to make sure that the shafts that I'm using for these have this little thing here in the middle of the drive shaft, because you'll see some have them at the end. So I want that to be in the middle. Those are the drive shafts that I need to use for this. So there's two of these. So now I'm not quite sure why I took this off. I need to recreate this because I need two of these. So here's this piece here. I need the pin for this. Okay. I want to make sure I do this facing the same way as the other one. So the pin here goes, it's the longer of the pins here. So there we go. And then I need an E-clip to hold this in place. Okay. Then I also need this guy here. Okay. I want to make sure that they're both kind of equidistant. Okay. At this point, let's start with this guy here. I know this is the bottom because it's kind of thrashed, you know, a little bit here. So yeah. I know that these little stands need to go in between the chassis, so I'm just trying to force that in there. Okay. And let's do the other one also here. Before I do, let me put a 8mm screw in here real quick to hold this in place so it doesn't come out. It makes me nervous bending this fiberglass because I'm afraid of cracking it. So that's why I'm just being overly cautious here. Trying to line this up here. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. So I'm not quite done here yet, fellas. Let's put this guy back. Okay, so now that we got these guys in place, now we need to hold these ball ends, these end rods, I should say. Well, the ball ends down. So we're going to use these guys here. Not those. These. I'm going to replace these screws. Okay, so what ends up needing to happen is I need to get this goes through here on the top, and then it goes, oops, trying to show this on the camera here. So it goes like it goes like so. Okay, then that goes through the chassis here. I keep dropping that front suspension. Oops. And then here we put in the lock nut. And I'm thinking I don't need a 20 millimeter screw. I think 18 is probably better because I don't think I got to screw anything else onto it. So let me replace these 20s with 18s instead. Yeah, 18 just makes it to the top of the lock nut. 20 would have stuck out a little bit more. I think I like the 18s better, so I'm going to stick with 18. But I don't think they had any 18 millimeter screws in the kit. It's kind of an odd size, so it probably was 20 to begin with. And I'm going to stick with 18 because I like that a lot better. So we'll do the same for the other side here. Okay. So that takes care of that. You can see the play. That's the thing you always want to be careful of when rod ends is these are capped, so they stick out a little bit more. If you were using smaller rod ends, these probably would get in the way of the travel. So you always want to be careful of that. These rod ends are pretty large, so they don't really get in the way of the travel, but that's something you want to always keep in the back of your mind, is making sure that your rod end can travel depending on the screw that you put on there. Okay. Okay. Well, I want to apologize. I wasn't keeping tabs on the camera and it ran out of power. Didn't get too far though before I realized what happened. So what we've got so far is the rear knuckles here, if you want to call them that, already mounted, and that's where I left off. So here's the thing though, I'm gonna have to replace this piece here. You can see there's a crack right there. So on top of replacing this piece that has a crack in it, I'm gonna replace this as well. So then I'm thinking, you know what? I might as well replace all four of these, the rear arms and the rear rods here on both sides. So in the meantime, I'm just going to go ahead and continue on with the build because it's not like I'm going to be running this thing anyways. So where we're at now is we've got the rear drive in place, but I want to give you one more tip though. If your kingpins ever don't line up like mine didn't, it's because this rod end here isn't out far enough. So I tightened this all the way, which is probably why that end cracked to begin with. So because it was in too far, the drive shaft was pushing the knuckle out and I couldn't line up the kingpins. So I had to take this pin out and then unscrew a little bit of it and then put the pin back, and then the drive shaft was in a good place where the kingpins would line up. See, you always learn from my mistakes. Okay, so I'm gonna put this wire back. It's a stabilizing wire. Okay. So the next part is this guy. Now, these guys are already put together and already have this little metal guide in place. But if it didn't, you'd have to deal with that. This looks bent just a little bit. It's not too bad. I mean, I can live with it. Obviously, the car was driven kind of hard. So I'm going to take this screw out because we're going to replace this with the hex bolt. So now this is going to go this way. That's going to be vertical. And this other side is going to be horizontal. So on the rear left here, this is basically going to bolt down onto the chassis here on the back. And then it's going to have a pin that holds it into the knuckle there. I keep calling them knuckles, but you know what I mean. So here's the deal with this. So we need a small nut underneath it because there needs to be some space between the ball end and the chassis. Otherwise, the ball end won't have any play in it because there'd be no space for it. So the movement isn't, the spacer is important for the movement. So I'm trying to find one that's reasonably thick, but not too thin here. But I think the one that we had was fine. So this uses 15 millimeters bolts, but I only have 14 and 16. 15 is kind of a strange size. So just so you know, I'm probably going to be using a 16 here, but it should be 15. Okay, I gotta realign these spacers here underneath so the holes line up. And then let's screw this guy in. these are screwing into the spacers that we put in earlier. I'll show you in a second here. And then here on the other side, we need this this pin. And then we need an E-clip for it. So these are the pins. It's a 2mm pin. And then they're held with an E-clip. Now we're set. Oh, Lord. Forgot to put the wire through the little metal, the metal shield there. So I'm going to have to take this off and then slide the metal rod through that hole right there. You can see that. There you go. Live and learn. So this is what we got. You can see the wire is now going through that little metal piece right there. See, so get the camera to focus here. There we go. So that wire slides right straight through, and you can see where the top of the rod end is screwed onto the spacer that was put underneath the chassis. As you recall earlier, we didn't put any screws up here, so you can also kind of see that little nut and how it creates some space between the rod end and the chassis plate. So this time, yeah, we're going to remember to route the wire correctly. Okay, got to put the bolt on, spacer. Okay, so now we're going to put the wire through. So now we need the pin. That'll hold the rod end in place. And then we need the E-clip for it. All right. So there's the rear of the chassis. Got the wires going through, the rod ends in place. Got the shaft all lined up